Ridge, a horse-like creature. Lewis Reinhardt has found another small horse that could be more like, maybe like a hyena-like creature with horse-like anatomy or legs. This is a cow. After I appeared on Coast in 2009, I received a call from a self-described Montauk researcher in Kansas who told me that Illuminati cattle barons were raising cows already on the Martian surface. Well, that would make sense because it would provide beef for the colony and fertilizer for the soil. But my question there is, well, what would a ruminant like a cow be eating on such a barren planet? But this does look like a black kind of heifer cow to me. It's way in the back and hence is very degraded. This is a frog-like or toad-like sculpture, I believe. A turtle-like sculpture. These, I believe, are living creatures. There are these serpentine-like creatures coming over the right side of Tsiolkovsky Ridge, and they have human-like faces, as many of the serpents do on Mars. Brett and I have confirmed that we were shown that by Ed Dames in 1980. And here's another slug or leech-like creature with a very Dr. Seuss-like head and face. One of the things that is astonishing the Mars anomaly research community, particularly findings made by Louis Michael Reinhardt, is that many of the indigenous creatures on Mars look Seuss-like, almost as if Theodor Geisel had been inspired by secret government files of what's on Mars or past life on Mars. Of course, we have the case of Boriska, the Russian boy who seems to be a Mars reincarnation-y. I was having flashbacks of a life on Mars. Maybe my experiences up there during these 3.5 years when I've been doing the research. But this is an example of the fact that some of the faces and heads of these creatures look disturbingly Seuss-like. We have then the second category, which are creatures that are hybrids of known Earth species, including living Earth species. Alfred introduced us here to what we're calling the land octopus, which is this terrestrial octopus-like structured creature with a very large face or head of like a Labrador retriever or even a lion in the center here. And again, he's moving towards the rover. So here you have, if it's a menagerie shot, that in NASA, if this image is a menagerie that NASA put up there, they really did superficial work because they had many life forms that are actually walking towards and facing the camera. But I don't think it's that, because I think these creatures are independently moving towards the camera, either to see what the rover is. By the way, I found out from Emily Craig. Emily Craig is a controversial figure in the Mars anomaly research field. But she told me that NASA put blinking lights and sound generators on the rovers to startle life forms and make them look up at the rover so they could be photographed. And throughout 10.2.14, I see evidence of that, where they seem to have been alerted by the presence of the rover spirit, and are actually moving across the West Valley of the Columbia Basin to see what this robot is that's moving and then across the surface of their home environment.
Are these things mostly carnivores?
Well, the general rule represented in Ed Dames' lecture with us, my experience up there, and the evidence from the data is that reptile life predominates on the surface of Mars. But not all are reptiles. For example, I think that would be more like a mammal with the traits of a dog or lion and an octopus. I don't believe that's a reptile, and I think that's probably so slow that, a child could easily outrun it.
Well, what do they eat?
Each other. And I'm kind of getting ahead of my lecture here, but in biomes where there's a very horizontal nutrient recycling cycle, what you have is rapacious consumption of predators by predators. For example, when Captain Jacques-Yves Cousteau took the crew of the Calypso to Clipperton Island, which is a desert atoll 1,300 miles west of Baja, California, he found that the whole island had been denuded of life except for one crab species that was cannibalizing itself. So what you have in a very arid and lifeless desert environment is rapacious predation of predators by predators. And hence humanoids like us become delicate prey. So this, I believe, was pretty slow moving. And he's actually with other creatures that are coming forward in this image. But that's too degraded here. Okay. Now, as I said, reptile species predominate. On Earth, the plesiosaur, this reptile with a turtle-like body, a long neck, and the head of sort of a horse or reptile or snake, and a little kind of turtle-like tail, did not survive the KT extinction. It has cropped up in the lake monster mysteries associated with Loch Ness, that is Nessie, Lake Champlain, or Champ. And we have the famous Susan Mancy shot of Champ and Lake Champlain, resembling this photo very much. And then we have also Lake Okanagan in British Columbia. But here on Mars, this creature seems to have survived whatever cataclysm caused the KT extinction on Earth. Here we have Plessy the plesiosaur that we've used as our logo for our organization. At greater detail, one like the one that chased me on Mars with Courtney, and one leaping out of an earthen embankment.
Wow. That's so cool.
If that's a statue, how come they didn't build any supporting struts to support it? Excuse me. Statuary is usually not built in a perilous way. So I believe this is a life form. Here's the turtle-like body and the neck and the head literally lunging out of the soft earth on Tsiolkovsky Ridge. So the third category would be extinct Earth species. These don't exist anymore on Earth. They exist on Mars, however, as indicated by the data coming back from the rover Spirit and Opportunity. The fourth category includes non-Earth species, including the hybrids. Throughout the image are these prone creatures that seem to possess the humanoid form of a Homo sapien, and yet the ground-dwelling traits of lizards. I don't know what they are. Excuse me. They could be, for example, proto-human lizard hybrids, but they're throughout the whole image. They seem to be life forms, and they even seem to be dressed in kind of gray tunics. So maybe they're embryonic forms of the gray ET-like humanoids. I don't know. But they're clearly kind of a hybrid of a lizard and a human being. In this category, we can also place creatures that we don't believe have ever existed on Earth, and hence, whilst much of the data from Mars indicates that the Martian biosphere shares a genetic heritage with Earth, because we find creatures that either exist on Earth or once existed on Earth, we also find several images every once in a while, clearly several in PIA 10214, we find several creatures that don't really resemble anything that has appeared on Earth. For example, a filamentous sponge-like creature with the head or face of a dog. And here, we see a puppy dog face inside this kind of soft, filamentous, land-based creature. It comes close to a sea sponge in its makeup, but a dog's face in its appearance. It could be a shaggy dog, but I was inventing fanciful names to interest school children in what's on Mars, so I called this the Woofy. And I took a whooping from Ray Villard and many others. So anyway, there's no way on Earth, in terms of the Earth, the descent of species on Earth, that you could have a sea sponge with that level of simplicity somehow hybridized without genetic engineering with a canine. So again, these are some of the exciting questions in biology, in this case exobiology, that we're going to see in the 21st century. This is one of my favorite shots because it shows both a life form and a statue. Here at the far right edge of the home plate plateau, you see this jagged sort of Doberman pinscher or demonic humanoid head. Can I see a show of hands of who can see a kind of like a Doberman pinscher, kind of savage canine or demonic face? the eyes, the nose socket, the mouth, and just kind of peering up towards the cliff. Clearly a statue that's been carved here in the, again, the available rock, just as the little lady in the blue dress on the far left side of the western edge of the home plate plateau is. Behind the statue, or excuse me, behind the cliff, however, seemingly standing, is this dromedary or giraffe-like face that we call the spying giraffe. Here's a close-up. The spying giraffe features bulbous eyes, blue shading around beneath its eyes on its face, and then almost reddish lips, and a kind of a giraffe-like coloration, a kind of a caramel and off-white coloration, and then some kind of sac on the top of its head, such as was possessed by dinosaurs to make sound. So I believe this is a small dinosaur-like creature and probably would be within the category of the kinds of predators that we were told we were not going to be able to evade. That is to say, something that would possess the intelligence of a human being, the instinct of a predator, and the speed of a small dinosaur. That's not something you're going to be able to even get your gun up at pretty quickly. But I just sense that this is a creature that clearly is agile in its environment. And it too is looking up at the rover spirit. Here's a close-up. It's kind of stretched out, but it does give you the bulbous eyes, the blue coloration, the almost clownish red lips, and then this kind of sort of dromedary, camel-like or giraffe-like head, some evidence of a neck, and then this sac-like protuberance on its forehead, which we know from our study of dinosaurs, as I said, was an air bladder that it used to make sounds, to mate, and to scare off predators and that sort of thing. Okay, now we also have corroboration of what I found in PIA 10214 in PIA 11049, another image altogether. So we've got another data set that we can use to corroborate the initial findings. PIA 11049, in the same way that 10214 is a westward view of the West Valley of the Columbia Basin, PIA 11049 is a southward view. It's just another sector on that side of the home plate plateau. The southern reaches beyond the plateau. Here I found three distinctive Martian creatures. This we're calling the Martian bear cat. It's like a big, shiny, furry cat or bear or beaver-like creature that seems to have the head and flesh-toned upper torso of a human in its mouth. And again, we can't throw our biases or belief systems on the data. This could be this creature's pet or animal companion, literally animal companion, like Wookiee in Star Wars, literally carrying it across the surface, or this could be a predator with either living or dead prey in its mouth there. But my point here is all this is a brown, furry creature that doesn't look like anything on Earth, but clearly shares characteristics of, I would say, just off the top of my head, a fish, a walrus, a bear, a cat, a mink, something brown, mammalian, and furry, with its fur shining in the sun. This is actually walking toward the distance, so basically southwest across the far southern reaches beyond the home plate plateau. This creature I'm calling the Martian rock hopper because it seems to be sort of a combination of a monkey and a grasshopper. We'll see a better image of that next. And then as Emily Craig confirmed very early in the game after I published my paper, she said, Andrew, you haven't found enough Sasquatch up there, son. So there were other people actually finding stuff up there. She said, I found these little Sasquatches all over their data. We're calling this the Sendak in honor of Maurice Sendak, author of the children's classic Where the Wild Things Are, certainly a children's classic that prepared this generation, that is my generation, for life on Mars. But just here's a close-up of what I'm calling the Martian bear cat, it seems to be grasping this human figure with his brown hair and flesh-toned upper torso in its mouth, but again, eating it, carrying it, rescuing it, playing with it, ejecting it, who knows. Here's the Martian rock hopper with this sort of strange monkey-like anatomy with lighter colored fur on its front or underbelly. And then these guys here, these two little sort of Martian humanoids, actually tucking themselves under the rock to hide, apparently, from this creature on top of the rock or beyond it. And here we have a close-up here of the potentially predatory, I would say, just from my training from Ed, rock hopper. You know, the predators we were shown looked more agile, like, you know, small dinosaurs or predators on Earth that have the anatomy and the agility to chase other prey, like a cheetah is a very agile and aquiline animal. So I see a lot more predatory potential in this creature than others. The Sasquatch, we primarily see them just sort of sitting around. In fact, this one's sitting here like you see a Sasquatch sitting on a log in Oregon or Washington, looking either this way or towards the camera. I've never really resolved whether that's his ear, you know, those are his eyes here and here, or that's simply his ear and his right eye is here and he's looking to the right like a bear would into a river, you know, in search of salmon. But this is very brown, very out of place, very shiny, very furry, and very bipedal and hominid in the original image. This is a little blurry, but you can even see the contrast of the sun on its fur, as we saw in the famous Roger Patterson, Stephen Gimlet photograph from, you know, Bluff Creek, California, that famous Bigfoot footage. Bob Gimlet. Now, near this rock garden where I found the grotesque humanoid skull, I noticed that up here, near it, there was something in the ground and it was eating something. So the general pattern of life on Mars is that if you're humanoid, you can be eaten. I mean, that's what Ed was training us in, and that's clearly what the data now shows. Here we have a reptilian-like animal, a reptoid animal, with snake-like appendages. They seem to be almost arms that are like half buried in the soil. And he is feeding. Okay, here this snake-like head or dinosaur-like head is biting on something. What he's biting on are the insides of a little humanoid. You can see the humanoid's head here, and the rest of its body is lying over here. Here you see the red, bloody viscera of this tiny little humanoid and its legs. And so what we see here is a kind of a snake-like reptile that's sitting half submerged in the soil and feeding on one or two little humanoids. Curiously, and this is just, I mean, I can't believe how long there's been data from Mars that establishes this pattern of reptoid predation of little humanoids. When I was a child in Project Pegasus, I was shown kind of like an X-ray astronomically derived image of little humanoids jumping off a rock on Mars and being consumed by this serpent. So here we literally find more evidence of that with him tearing something from the upper torso, here's the head, of a poor little humanoid, and then the humanoid's midsection cut off here with the red blood and his feet, his legs and feet right here. So I think what's disturbing as primates who have reached the top of our food chain on Earth, except for occasional predation, let's say, by the... Like, for example, in North America, the only two species that still stalk humans overground are the grizzly bear and the puma, also called mountain lion. We have subdued every other species on the North American continent, including all the bear species, which primarily evade us, unless we get between them and their young. Well, the disturbing thing is that on Mars, humanoids do not necessarily occupy the top of the food chain as they do on Earth, at least not all the time. And that begs the question of, as we interact with the humanoid population on Mars, do we exercise the precautionary principle and rescue humanoids from reptoid predation when we have the opportunity? Excuse me, and not intervene in their food chain or their ecosystem? And if we see a poor little Martian humanoid being chased by this little dinosaur-like creature and eaten, or potentially eaten, do we keep hands off and exercise the precautionary principles so as not to disturb the balance of their ecosystem? Or do we apply, for example, the use cogens norms that we have in public international law outlawing, for example, genocide, and intervene to save another humanoid life. As we travel more and more to Mars and have a greater presence there, it's going to set up these inevitable conflicts of laws, precautionary principle versus anti-genocide, for example, and we're going to have to decide what to do. I think what we should probably do is not intervene in the ecosystem of Mars because we don't know enough about what the consequences would be. It seems to me almost like a classic case for the application of the precautionary principle rather than more idealistic notions and nostrums from public international law. Here's another example of a reptoid. We have this green head of this dinosaur-like little or lizard-like creature standing behind its prey, which is, here's the blue costume of a humanoid, here's his head lying on the ground, and sadly you can see that his legs have been bitten off right about where our knees would be. And you can see that in fact the reptoid's about the size of this humanoid and still apparently has killed it and is guarding his prey on the surface, as a reptile predator would in a biome where there's very little available nutrition for any creature. Here's a close-up where we can see this sort of bug-eyed green head of a reptoid here, and here's a close-up of the humanoid's head and his pale blue garb and what's left of his legs. I have a kind of a blocked memory, I think, of somebody actually, a human from Earth actually undergoing, being killed by a predator on the surface, and I think I pretty much have it blocked it because he just fought it and then his gun ran out, or he lost his gun or something. He just kind of surrendered, made a joke, and got eaten. But so I'll have to have some hypnotherapy to pull it up to conscious recollection. Clearer recollection, I should say. Okay, so if human beings from Earth have died in visiting Mars, doesn't the rest of the human race have a right to know it? Wouldn't we be honoring the memory of those who sacrificed their lives visiting this other planet, the planet that every 2 years comes closest to our planet, by telling everybody else, hey, just as the Europeans said, well, there's not sea dragons in the edge of the earth out there. There's this continent. There's this place called America that we're calling America. There are people living there on the other side of the ocean. But instead, our government, the very government that our Congress, the very space agency, for example, that our Congress ordered to tell us the truth about space and the near-Earth environment, is holding back the truth about life on Mars from the people of this planet. And I think that's wrong and needs to be corrected immediately. So here are some of my favorite findings. This is a sculpture that is down the home plate plateau in the center of the image. There's like a little sculpture garden. This one is not an actual bee. It's the statue of the bottom of a bee, and these diaphanous bee-like wings that stretch out are actually carved into the wall of the cliff. Many people have said, Andy, that's probably one of your hybrids, with here the head of a man looking back towards the back of the bee. But in fact, we've got a kind of a blurring here of the color contrast. The diaphanous wings are literally a sculpture effect that was abraded from the edge of the cliff, making it look like wings. To me, this is really high concept art. I'd like to see what a fine artist like Jean-Luc would say. But I mean, here we have a natural life form, a bee, a bumblebee, on its back. You can even see the stinger here. And its wings, and it's beating its wings. But it's a hybrid. It's got the gold head of a man. Brett said, hey, Andy, maybe this was you. Maybe, Andrew means man or manly. Here's the head of an android, a man, with the body of a bee. And not only does your last name start with B, but you told me that Bashago means beehivesman in Polish. Because Basha is the medieval Latin word for a beehive, one of those circular beehives. So in a sense, we get Ander B, we get Andy B. I don't think so. I don't think they know who I am. But we are going to start an awards program at Mars, and we're going to have this struck in gold. Instead of being called the Oscar, it's going to be called the Andy B. So it'll be it'll be a rendering of a bee in a kind of a painted glazed porcelain with the gold head of a man. Oh, and by the way, the man has antennae, Martian antennae, like Ray Walston in My Favorite Martian. So closer examination shows it's not just gold, but has little antennae. Now, the body and wings are sculpted, but maybe this is a cyborg. Maybe this is a 500-year-old Martian humanoid who's got his head locked into some kind of cybernetic system or whatever, a cryogenic system to survive. I don't know, but if it is artwork, which I think it is, I think it shows the high intelligence and creativity of the sculptor. One of the most dramatic findings, a finding that literally made one of our anomalists fall off his chair, was Ross Curley's epic finding of the face of a pharaoh on a slab of rock or metal that the rover Spirit was just driving by and took a picture. On this rock, there's a set of sort of like Martian graffiti or drawings. But what's really astonishing is that the drawing in the upper right where the edge here forms a kind of a pyramidal background in the way that the Sphinx sits in front of the Great Pyramid, is the face of a pharaoh, an Egyptian pharaoh. And we know that the High Egyptian civilization reached the other planets in the solar system during the reign of King Akhenaten, for whom Nefertiti was the royal consort. And of course, I should have included a picture of Nefertiti, but the classic bust of Nefertiti, found by the German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt at Amarna, Egypt in 1912, shows the coloration of Mars. You know, the blood red, the drab green, the turquoise, the black, the white, etc. The rust red. Well, here we have not a female figure such as the bust of Nefertiti, but a male Egyptian leader with the classic conical headdress, the cobra ready to strike motif, which was called a wadjet, which was the protector of Lower Egypt, which became sort of the national icon under the reigns of the pharaohs, in the way that the bald eagle represents the United States. So here's Wadjet, the cobra ready to strike that they had above their pineal gland, you know, their third eye. Then we have a face that seems to possess both European and African features. We know that during the reign of the pharaohs, the Egyptians, who were, you know, Near Easterners and hence Caucasian, began to adopt the children of the Nubians or the Ethiopians, take them into the Egyptian leadership class, sometimes intermarry with them, but also often creating pharaohs of them. There was a whole line of black pharaohs. This individual may be one of them. It's an individual that possesses sort of a biracial phenotype, like Barack Obama, for example, possesses, with a white mom and a black dad. I don't think it's Obama. I think it's maybe Akhenaten. Our friend Freeman Fly has found the connections between the Obama family and Akhenaten's family. In fact, he was symbolized by the radiance of the sun and the rosebud, and those are the two Secret Service handles for his two daughters, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, here we have a pharaoh with both Caucasoid and Negroid features. We can see his eyes, his nose, his mouth, and like all of the Egyptian pharaohs on Earth and on Mars, not just a beard, but a beard growing directly from the bottom of his chin. So if anybody wants to see this closer, if it's a little blurry there, come up and I can show you online here, because it's crystal clear right here. And Ross, who's a retired individual living in Illinois, in McHenry, Illinois, he told me, "Andy, you're not going to believe what I found," and I just literally fell off my chair.
Andy, there's
Yep.
another picture of a pharaoh, the one before that, at
Uh-huh.
the very edge of the rock. If you go back,
Yeah.
at the very edge of the rock.
Right here?
Left. No, go to the left. Keep going. Keep going. The other way. Left. Left. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Right there.
Right there?
Right. You see it? Just at the edge, right there. There's his eye. You see a profile. There's the nose, the mouth, the chin.
Yeah. See, these are the discoveries. I mean, we focus on one thing we found to the exclusion of, you know, spending another 10 hours, because this is like basically the funnest game you will ever play when you get into it, because here we're basically looking at either an intaglio, like a sculptured statue-like work of art, or maybe a stamp that was placed in a slab of metal. This may be degraded iron or something, right? Or who knows, tin or silver or what have you. But this is literally the evidence of the high Egyptian civilization on Mars. Okay? And, you know, that's a game changer. End of story. We've now established the connection between ancient Egypt and ancient Mars. We're calling this the Rosetta Stone of Mars because it allows us to conclude that the high Egyptian civilization reached Mars because they put the iconography of their leadership class on Martian rocks. Here's a blow-up. Here's another creature that Ross found. A lot of my favorite finds are Ross's, some of my own, but Ross has really had a streak of good luck, and because he spends a lot of time doing this, I've been a little bit more challenged, but I'm still doing research. But Ross has just discovered some incredible things. We're calling this the face of the speckled gremlin. It's a gremlin-like face that appeared right in front of the rover Spirit. It has a kind of an illuminated bodhisattva-like creature kneeling on its forehead. And in fact, its distinctively humanoid face is made up by a series of smaller humanoids stretching itself around another object. So we don't know, it's almost like a colony of little humanoids that make up a major humanoid that in turn has some artificial light device on its head.
It's almost like he's praying, the one on the right. His hands are up and he has the two legs.
Yeah.
His hands behind again.
Yeah, so when you look at this, and it's clear here on my screen, I've got other versions of it, you have this frog-like or toad-like face, but the differentiation that creates that appearance is being made by little humanoids who are stretching around some kind of superstructure. And then there's the bodhisattva figure on top. Well, I found similar things in other locations on Mars. There are colonies of sentient life forms that exist on Mars, like we would make if we made a barrel of sticky monkeys and then just compacted them and just rolled them out on a tabletop. In other words, smaller humanoid life forms occluding to create a super being. We don't have that on Earth, but it exists on Mars. I don't think that NASA JPL was creative enough to have faked that. Now that was Ross's discovery. I did further analysis on his image. I searched forward and back to do what we were talking about. Is it still there in that same location? And I found that it actually faded out. On my paper I said, going, gone. What we found is that animal became degraded into kind of like a scarecrow-like face, a kind of a thin old man kind of face with an eyes here and a nose and a kind of a bewildered kind of expression, like, oh, I better morph into another state of being. And then it actually fades out altogether. So the speckled gremlin, as we called it, that Ross found, ended up presenting the first evidence of a trans-dimensional being morphing into non-existence on another planet. So it goes from a speckled gremlin face to this thinner, more sort of elderly human-looking, sort of startled old man kind of face into literally nothing in the adjacent photographs, which is not a photo effect, but literally a time series of its movement from a physical to a paraphysical to an invisible state. So that was a breakthrough that I'm very happy that Mars accomplished. Now, of course, the glass tubes on Mars have been a major part of the Mars mystery. They were the focus of the last science piece that Miles O'Brien did for the CNN Science Desk after 17 distinguished years, a lot of it doing stories about the space program and the moon and Mars and so forth. In December of 2008, in January 2009, right after my paper was researched and written and published by Alfred at exopolitics.com, around January 4th of 2009, Miles did his last piece for CNN before CNN fired its entire science desk. He was walking through the home of a Mars anomalist somewhere in the United States, I think in Arizona, commenting on everything he was seeing in this person's images from Mars. And he ended with a statement about, I wonder what those glass tubes are. Is that volcanic glassine ejecta from the surface? Is that some kind of silicate deposit in a rift on Mars? And so I said, Ross, I think we better go in and see if in fact that's more of a hallway or an artificial structure that has been kind of oozed into creation by the indigenous civilization on Mars. And what Ross found is that looking out from the ribs of the glass tube were humanoids. Here you can see him looking out like somebody would look out a window. Here's his head, his eyes, mouth, his body, and his arms. It's sort of like people look out of a burning building, for example, the poor people who were trapped in the Twin Towers. You know, people lean out of windows and look up or out. So here we have, there's different versions of this, but basically inside the ribs, beyond the glass, there are either humanoids intentionally staring out or some kind of bizarre sculpture field, you know, some kind of art gallery where they made glass tubes on the surface and then stuck a bunch of statues in them. I don't think an advanced intelligent civilization would do that. What's the point? I think that these glass tubes that we see on the surface are more like the causeways that we make at airports, where you walk down a hallway and because the planes are arriving and taking off, you can look outside the windows and see the airport. A lot of these are on ridges that are high up above valleys, and they may be safe areas where humanoids can walk down this glassine hallway and look out at vista points on the surface of Mars. The area beneath this shot is very scenic. I can't put it, include it here. But what I think these are, and actually you can see a human bleeding through there. What I think these is architecture. I think these they use some kind of glass blowing technique, or they're working with polymers or plastics or something to create a viewing area for humanoids that's safe from predation on the surface. Okay, now this last piece is actually my favorite find, not because it produces what is, in my view, the most exquisite animal or humanoid that we've found on the surface, but because this photograph of possible trees on Mars made the world press in January of 2010. For example, it was published in every British newspaper except The Independent. But all the tabloids and all the papers that are considered legitimate in England published it. It's like a sand dune-like area on a hillside where there was speculation as to whether or not these objects, which look sort of like cacti or bristlecone pines, were trees or not. Clearly they look like trees in a vegetated desert planet. They look like the kinds of bristly kinds of plants that you find, for example, in sand dunes. Published throughout the world, there was no discussion about the fact that many of the images in the different sand dune areas are actually rock carvings, but I won't even discuss that. What I did is I went to each of the stands of putative trees and blew them up and tried to find out what they were. They could be trees, they could be deciduous, cactus, some kind of bristlecone thing. They're basically these pipe cleaner-like objects sticking out of the sand. So I blew up every major stand. And what I found to my astonishment in one of the stands was a creature that we're calling the striding gremlin. You can see the protuberances on top of his head, his eyes, his tiny little mouth, his ET or sort of amphibian-like head. He's walking and looking to the left. We can actually see his gaze as his intelligent eyes and the intelligent posture of his mouth are open as he looks to his left as he moves this way across the image. Very thin body type, like many of the extraterrestrials that have been reported in the UFO contact literature. And in his hands, he's carrying a humanoid in his arms, right here. And the humanoid is actually wearing a white shirt and pants, and we can see the flesh tones of his legs and his shoes. Again, this could be lunch for the striding gremlin, or it could be an amusement park where humans on the surface are playing some ride called the striding gremlin. I mean, we don't know. But you can come up and look at it here if you can't see it here. Here's another blow-up of it. I widened it to show the articulation in the head a little bit more clearly. Who sees a sentient life form in this image? A little bit fewer people. I think the principle here, I certainly do. I think the principle here is it's a strange creature by our reckoning. So let me try to do the outline here. Here we have these protuberances on the top, and then we have a head that tapers into a very long neck. Here's the back of the head. His skin is mottled in complexion like the speckled gremlin that we just looked at. He's got white and green patches on his face and neck. Here's his right eye, his left eye, the area where his nose should be. A lot of ETs haven't had noses, have they? And then his mouth. And his head is kind of recessed into a kind of gently flowing neck. He doesn't really have a chin. And then he goes down into the stick-like body. And in his arms, right here, he's holding a small human form with feet or sneakers, socks or shoes or sneakers or something on this humanoid's feet.
One or two. I mean, because it looks like he's edging your mom.
Could be two. I think it's more like when you carry a baby, so the baby's kind of sitting in your midsection, kind of like that. But I'm not sure. Is there a question there? Okay. Ken.
My first glance at it, of course now I see what you described, but my first take on it, the whole form that's jutting above the horizontal plane or that crosses across the middle looks like a woman in a pantsuit carrying a bag of groceries.
Right. Well, this is the principle of tolerance that we have to apply to independent judgments of what's in them. But
I still see a humanoid though. I don't see an artificial. A natural form.
Yeah.
You don't see an
Optical illusion.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, so
it's interesting.
basically you have a creature that is half head, and it has a gently tapering head like an extraterrestrial.
Okay.
And then right at about the shoulders here, we see the left leg and then the right leg here behind him. He's striding forward like this, holding something. And when we blew up what he was holding, it was a human form in the same way that somebody would sit in a seat in like one of those whirly-bird amusement park rides. In other words, like if you have a swinging basket-like device. And then here's the head of the humanoid, his shirt, his legs, and the white indicated where his feet should be. So if this is a Mars colonist, this could be anything. This could be, again, a Martian life form that interacts in a symbiotic way with humans and plays with them, carries them across the vast distance of the Martian surface. It could be a predator that has just killed this human or is going to kill it, to eat it. It could be some artificial or genetically engineered construction that's carrying this. But if you want to come up and look at my laptop, you can see that we have high articulation in this modeled face of this creature, which, like the spine giraffe that we just looked at, has some kind of protuberance or air bladder-like extension on its head. So I think this picture, ultimately, when it's fully analyzed, is a game changer because it'll allow us to say, well, wait a minute, there's a life form there, but this picture went all the way around the world. We're not even looking at what's in the data. I mean, we're supposed to be an intelligent civilization here on Earth. Okay, so some final thoughts. And then I'll take as many questions as you'd like to ask. Let's see here. So, final thoughts are that Mars is inhabited. If you don't believe all of the data, I would urge you to consider some of the data, which I think, as we say in the law, creates a rebuttable presumption that something is true, which means that it establishes the premise that that thing is true until it's successfully refuted. It's sort of like a preliminary yes. I think it's even more. It's like a supra-rebuttable presumption at this point. And all those who are providing information about the U.S. presence there, let's just say you want to tackle what the Mars anomalists are saying. Well, then you're going to have to refute the data because the data is becoming overwhelming. I don't believe that NASA is hiring dozens of artists to paint fake life forms into its images, especially when NASA seems devoted to adhering to the Robertson panel to literally debunk and ridicule claims of extraterrestrial life, which is what the Durant report of the Robertson panel was about in 1953. So I believe the data convincingly shows to a clear, convincing, and compelling standard of evidence that Mars is inhabited. Because that's the case, we must craft law and policy pertaining to our activities on Mars, or future activities if you don't believe we've reached Mars, with a view to the fact that Mars is not only another planet, but an inhabited planet. We must therefore protect Mars under international treaty from the externalities of visitation, exploration, habitation, and colonization by human beings from Earth. In visiting and exploring Mars, we must proceed cautiously and diplomatically in consideration of the fact that Mars has an indigenous ecology and an indigenous civilization, and that indigenous civilization has been built over many thousands of years by advanced, intelligent, humanoids, much like ourselves. The habitation and colonization of Mars has already begun. That's my position. It was the reason I was sent to Mars in 1981 to 83, and the reason that Laura Eisenhower was asked to go to Mars and join the secret Mars colony in the 2006-2007 timeframe. Why would the CIA or any U.S. agency over a 25-year time frame bamboozle the son of an engineer consulting the CIA and the great-granddaughter of an American president to believe that there was a U.S. presence on Mars? Why would that have been done? And why, for example, would they have selected Brett, somebody 5 years younger than me, to support my notions of being on Mars if it would have been much more credible to say that I was up there with a bunch of same-aged chrononauts, right? In other words, a lot of those sharply focused, highly articulated facts of our claims basically establish the truth of what we're saying, because the truth, as Mark Twain said, is stranger than fiction. So we're at an epochal time in human history where the fact that we have undertaken activities secretly on Mars has been hidden from the awareness of the human population on Earth, and therefore humanity at large has not given its consent to the range of human activities that are underway on Mars. Because Mars has an indigenous ecology and civilization, this development is fraught with peril for the human race on Earth. It has implications and complications of a profound political, historical, and philosophical nature that must be publicly debated if we are to interact with Mars in such a way that we pass the first major test of our cosmic citizenship, which is how we treat another planet as we encounter it. We must also extend the protections provided human life forms and animal life forms and entire ecosystems that we find today on Earth in public international law, environmental law, endangered species protection, and international environmental law, respectively, to Mars, for in the final analysis, Mars does not belong to us, it belongs to the Martians. So what I'm saying is that if I'm elected president in 2016 or whenever, when I'm elected, I'm going to do the bold and independent thing. I'm going to tell the American people the truth. The truth is constantly being held back from us. We should be angry about this. We should take direct action regarding this. I'm going to tell the American people and the people of the world that Mars, the planet that every 2 years comes closest to Earth, indeed our celestial neighbor, is many things. It's clearly a repository of ancient artifacts of great historical value. In fact, precious artifacts that show the history of our solar system, even the catastrophic history of our solar system. And hence the great work that Richard C. Hoagland and George Haas and William Sanders and others have done over the last 30 years. It's also a planet inhabited with its own indigenous ecology and civilization, which is presently being demonstrated by the research, the anomaly researchers that I cited and others. And it also has a U.S. presence that was begun in the late 70s, as revealed by the whistleblowers that are now courageously coming forward. I'm going to tell the people the truth that Mars has a past, a present, and a future, and that if we're to do the right thing, the U.S. government must tell the truth about life on Mars and the American presence there, so that every human being on Earth can participate in the future of Mars. Thank you. So I'd be happy to open up the floor to any questions that you might have.
I have some.
Yes, Star.
With respect to what do you do if you see one of the creatures eating a little humanoid? What do you do? Well, what are the Martian people who came to Earth that you met?
Yeah.
How do they interact with them? What do they do? What's their protocol, for example?
We don't know. It seems that some of the humanoids being consumed by reptoids seem to be a smaller, stubbier species. They may be just animals that look like humans, but I guess the conflict is that the precautionary principle states that you take no action if you can do irreparable harm to a natural system. But what we see being consumed are bipedal hominids that we identify with as such.
Right.
And our own legal mores require us to intervene to save human life from genocide. The reason I bring up the word genocide is not to exaggerate, but because in the gully beyond the home plate plateau, there are thousands of humanoid bodies. I just didn't want to share that kind of macabre fact in Kona, Hawaii, such a beautiful natural area, such beautiful people. But that's where the data goes when we analyze PI 10214, is it doesn't look like a big cemetery. It looks like a big humanoid killing field where reptoids are making this big sticky goo of humanoids. So we're talking about basically two diametrically opposed legal nostrums coming into direct conflict, and that's going to require the participation of our greatest minds like Alfred Weber. Ken?
In fact, when you mentioned that part that you just referenced, I just go back to 150 years when we were conquering the Great Plains and going by in trains and cowboys just decimating the buffalo herds.
Shooting
or
buffalo
those
with
what.
Winchester rifles from the trains.
You know, exactly. So at least we have some kind of terms of engagement policy in place now that hopefully will not repeat the extremes of the past.
Well, yeah. Well, let me address where we are in the historical moment. Where we are in the historical moment is the human civilization on Earth, at least in a hortatory sense, following World War II, is committed to upholding the Nuremberg principles outlawing aggressive warfare, genocide, and crimes against humanity. So that was the evolution of the 40s and 50s. And then the evolution in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were the environmental and international environmental protections to protect endangered species and ecosystems, where you have a whole another set of principles. So there are really two areas of law that are coming into direct conflict. Since it's not our planet, and I guess since I'm an environmentalist, I would urge the precautionary principle rather than the application of use cogents norms outlawing genocide, because although they are humanoids being consumed, they're being consumed on another planet in an entirely different ecosystem context. So who are we to presume that we have to save them?
Or even just go willy-nilly shooting guns or weapons out there because, you know, you see something to shoot or defend yourself or, you know, or
Yeah,
else.
I mean, it's heartrending to see another humanoid being devoured like a rodent, but that's what we're finding in the images. Could that be disinformation from NASA? Again, they're not going to refute extraterrestrial life by establishing it. That's completely illogical. They're not in that game. Star.
So could any of these creatures be successfully brought back to Earth?
Probably already.
Question, or have any of them? And then also, like, when you go up there, or when others are living up there, how do they feed themselves? Like, do they send a big Suisan truck full of food up through a jump?
Well, you know,
Or how does the practical aspect of living in, like, do they have internet? Can they call on walkie-talkies? I mean, how do they communicate?
well, I said that, you know, taking the jump room to Mars from El Segundo to Mars was easier than taking the red eye from Los Angeles to New York.
Oh, yes.
I mean,
yes.
the jump rooms are getting up there in 20 minutes or so, 25. At least they were in 1981 to 83, so they're maybe even going up faster. So servicing the human colony, or the large superstructures that are up there now for the U.S. colony, is a piece of cake. It's easier than putting, you know, Florida oranges on a 16-wheeler and pointing it at Seattle.
Yeah.
Okay, and then how about the creatures? Could
They could come here. I asked Courtney Hunt, I said to him, you know, being aware of what was going on in the space program and having a dad in that area of, you know, that era, and having, you know, astronaut posters on my wall, and then being involved in Pegasus, I was very keenly interested in the space program as a child and so forth. And I remembered the fact that the Apollo astronauts, for example, were in seclusion for 72 hours to prevent contamination of our human civilization on Earth with bacteria and virus that might be on the moon. And I said, how come we're not being screened each time we come back or quarantined? And he said, we've determined that the germ profile on Mars is identical to Earth's. Now, maybe that's the case because of the interaction, the commerce, and the movement of Earthlings and Martians during the first civilization on Earth, that all the basic bacteria and virus were spread to each respective planet. But then after 11,500 years of isolation, you would figure that some of those protozoa would start swimming in the opposite direction and so forth. So I think it was just basically CIA negligence that he even said that we weren't being screened. Yes?
An anomaly I see is, why would they spend time making all these sculptures? That's time consuming if your chance of being eaten in 30 seconds is so great.
Well, we were doing things that took hours of duration up there too. The situation you're in is one in which you simply have to remain wary for what might be coming over the horizon. It's not a feeding frenzy because it's a desert planet where most life forms are immediately evident the minute they're anywhere near your environment. So if you think of, let's say, the Anza Borrega Desert down in San Diego, you can be hiking and you can see a turtle flop over a ridge, half a mile away. So it's easy to not be eaten there. The problem is that some of them were faster than us, but most of them were slower than us. And hence we would assume for the humanoids that are doing the sculpting, they can look around and protect themselves. But they also are very furtive and tend to stay underground or in buildings. They're not foolhardy. They're not like all traipsing all over the countryside. I mentioned how when I walked down that road on the way to the dilapidated brick building to deliver the data disk, that I'd see Martians sort of furtively looking out of doors, in their black or dark blue caftans. So it's just not, it's not an environment where any humanoid can presume to feel as safe as we would, simply having to avoid stepping on a rattlesnake in the Anza Borrega Desert, right? But so they can enjoy the surface. They just have to be more watchful of potential predators. Right here, ma'am. Right there. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Could it be possible, you were saying that there was sulfuric.
There was a sulfur odor when I took off my mask. Yes.
To me, all these statues, many of the statues, dead or alive, seem so arbitrarily spread over the area. Could some of them be remnants of a change in air or eruption, and as in Pompeii, some of them?
Yes. I didn't show it here because I wanted to show life on Mars rather than death on Mars. But we do have details of fossilized or calcified human remains that are very similar to the human remnants at Pompeii following that volcanic eruption, where humans are covered by volcanic ash or the pyroclastic flow, and they become mummified, so to speak. And then when you have erosion, those natural mummies are sort of exfoliated from hillsides and that type of thing. We have literally several that look like modern human beings, the remains of modern human beings, but they seem quite ancient, literally strewn on a hillside after apparently being. There are a lot of dried mud flows and other evidence of the catastrophe of 9500 BC affected them as well. So there are many remnants of living humanoids that were killed during the catastrophe that are neither current life forms nor statues, but are in fact the sort of the fossilized natural remains of humanoids on the surface. Hold on, Ken, right here.
Why do you think they stopped working with you after 83? And did they pay you at all during 81 through 83 to be a courier?
These special access programs just work in peculiar ways. They don't share complete information with anybody. Hence my point about my dad, that he may have been told there were 2 future presidents in the classroom of 10, and it may have been 7, They don't share information. Even doing something simple as having me have Courtney Hunt train me in the respiration device over at Cal State Northridge, and then going to Burbank to do the thing to watch, every 30 seconds. They're always compartmentalizing functions like that too. That's why they confuse logical people so much. They also have a habit of involving people in these special access programs and then just summarily kicking them out of the projects, just so that if the person's obsessed with it or troubled by it or being challenged by it for a couple of years, then they kick them out of it and they can get back in their ordinary life. And if they talk about what they were in, they can be urged, like my brother urged me to see a psychiatrist. They regularly terminate people and recycle them out of these special access programs so that no person does everything, sees everything, knows everything, or talks about everything. So after those 3 years of going up there, it was sort of like, okay, Andy, you're going to be getting your college degree in a year. Bye-bye. I just wasn't called anymore to go into Santa Monica, to go over to El Segundo and bring the disc up to Mars. So it's just basically the arbitrary way that the intelligence community works all the time, in a kind of an intentional arbitrary approach. Ken?
You mentioned the peripheral social life, during Project Pegasus, eating in the restaurants and,
Yeah.
The human contact.
Oh, it was...
Do you have recollection of spending enough time on Mars where you had to have a drink or a refreshment or nourishment?
No, there was never...
or anything?
No, I was going and returning quickly,
Wow.
sometimes spending hours up there, but I was never drinking. I was getting chronically dehydrated. I still am. Brett doesn't remember any food either. And another thing about the Obama-Dugan connection is we never met them up there. We don't know whether they audited that class for a Mars enrichment seminar for a future president and DARPA director, or whether there's this rebuttable presumption that the President of the United States was brainwashed as we were, and then sent up there.
Or in the corridors, or say at the base stations where you arrived, looking down hallways or anything, did you see any logical forms of, logistics like?
Well, there was one strange thing. It was actually an illogical form. Well, actually, let me use your question as a segue to an illogical element. Brett and I both remember being sent to a hallway that was kind of built under an arbitrary freeway overpass-like structure. And we were told, you'll come out of the jump room in the middle of the hallway and try to walk as far as you can in either direction, but make sure that you don't get eaten at the end, because there's sometimes predators will come out and stand there and see if they can run in and go grab a human and have lunch.
Sounds like a Greek tragedy or something.
And one did when I was there, but I ran back. But anyway, we were basically put under the keen psychological tension, the almost overwhelming tension, of being asked to arrive in this stupid superstructure and then go out to the end where we might be eaten. And even though we had a weapon, you're still thinking, I don't want to take on some little dinosaur-like creature in this thing that looks like, the hallway in a junior high school bungalow. This is a weird place to be. I don't want to be here. In other words, there were some very dehumanizing things and we figured that what they must have been doing is putting humans not just in their list of everybody they had sent up there, but literally creating the case for territorial sovereignty and acquisition of Mars by putting teleportees all over the planet, even if they had to create this structure like this in a place where there were a lot of predators.
You mentioned that CIA guy or somebody that was like a prospector living out, on your running radio interviews, you were walked out to the guy that had been living in some bungalow out on the fringe?
Well, no, I was talking about Howard, about living in like a stone cottage.
Oh, yeah.
But that's a segue to the fact that in one of those hallways, some kind of predator had shot something at several humans, and they were sort of sticking up in the corner of the hallway, like in a clear glassine, like ejecta from an animal. And the joke was, it was Newman. Oh, that's Newman. Nobody liked him anyway. And there was like this, human from our civilization who had been, So there were some very macabre elements, and it was a constant assault to your psyche. And I'm happy to say that neither Brett nor I or the others have been up there committed suicide, but it was really, Laura used a wonderful metaphor. I almost actually started crying, which was, sort of like being placed in a season of hell. I think you used Hades as the metaphor. My mind was often racing with the sensation that like I was in a low-grade nightmare. And maybe that's what the settlers found when they came and found in the New World, just, 99% acreage covered with trees, and thought, we're going to have to hack our way and create a village in this dense forest. But that's what it was like. It was like we had been subjected this urgent drive to put a human presence on Mars and conquer it had led to the constant dehumanizing tension and inner turmoil of a kind of a low-grade nightmare type of psychological state. And fortunately, I adjusted. And fortunately, now the information is coming back so that we can share it with others. But it was an unfun place to be for the most part. I wouldn't wish it on somebody. Ma'am?
Did you ever see any evidence of other ET civilization visits? Like any, when you looked up, did you ever see any craft moving? Did you ever hear from the human colony? about other ET civilization visits?
Well, I was up there when Colony was truly a colony, not a modern colony with beautiful functional buildings. The colonial presence there was cobbled together arbitrarily, even in some sort of defunct Martian villages that you might find, like when you go hiking in the hinterlands of Mongolia and you find some 10,000-year-old town and you kind of walk through the remnants of a city. It was more like that than a real modern hotel-like colony. But apropos of your question about evidence of ET life on the surface, we have the Martian human typology that is like the great ETs. Also, in the kind of sculpture garden that we find there along Tsiolkovsky Ridge, there's a sculpture of a lenticular craft with a little beam poking out of it. There's a kind of a memorialization of different themes of spaceflight on different parts of Tsiolkovsky Ridge, including this kind of exquisite jade green boulder with a highly articulated Asiatic face and several rocket sculptures lying on top of it, as if memorializing, let's say, an ancient Chinese rocket probe that successfully landed on the red planet. So I would say that the consciousness that informed the sculpture was aware of the phenomenon of visitation by extraterrestrials to our solar system. Right here?
Two questions.
Sure.
Did you ever get to see into the future of Mars? And never. Okay. How many Martians, guessing, are living underground, I guess, and humans?
Great question. Let me kind of pull apart the elements of this because I think it may still be unexplained or contradictory. When I published my paper, I received a telephone call from Virginia Olds of the CIA. And she kind of infiltrated my life in 2005 and 6. Laura knows the pattern, you know. And she was just overt CIA, but she was being extremely meddlesome in my life. And but after I published the paper in December of 2008, she said, you're spot on with all your conclusions. And regarding the humanoid population there, it numbers about 1 million. It does live primarily underground. And it consists of several typologies, one very much like us, and one very much like the gray ETs of the contact literature. We're also talking about the U.S. presence there, which David Wilcock now estimates at 550,000. So that would make sense that it would be around there by now because of the carrying capacity. But the Martian humanoid population is not believed to be very, very big. Of course, in one recent find, I saw the tracks of opportunity in the Meridiana planum of Mars, and out of the tracks, these 1 foot width tracks, pop several little humanoids about the size, presumably, of prairie dogs. So I think there are more than 2 typologies of humanoids, and some actually burrow in the dirt like prairie dogs do. So we can't, when we say humanoid, we really mean an animal with a cranium, bisymmetrical eyes, nostrils, mouth.
Simian.
Yeah, simian might be a better primate. Yeah, because, well, is a prairie dog's not a primate, but it shares a face, a torso, 4 appendages, and so forth. So some of this is definitional. But we found small creatures popping out of the dirt that look surprisingly human-looking. Star.
So, the people who visited again that you met down in the States, I'm wondering, how did they manufacture their spacecraft, for example?
Right, well.
And how do they support underground 1 million human types?
Well.
How do they do food? How do they do water?
What I saw of them,
practical part.
what I saw of them was their close similarity to us, physically speaking,
Right.
their high intelligence, their advanced spacecraft, the fact that we know that they're the vestige of a high civilization that sought refuge underground in a solar system catastrophe that affected both Earth and Mars. And when I arrived via jump room the first time and the second time with Courtney, our jump room infrastructure had been kind of placed in an ancient cavern that apparently they had architected. So the answer is in exquisitely architected, Tolkien-esque caverns underground. Now, there's corroboration of their advancement provided by the remote viewing team of Courtney Brown, in which he concluded they were 150 years ahead of us technically. That may be a bit of an overstatement. They were clearly ahead of us in the early 70s, because we didn't reach anything approaching supersonic with that type of craft until the Aurora in the 1980s and 90s. So I don't know. I mean, I can only talk about what I know. I have had only minimal contact with that faction of Martian that has been aligned with us. And we don't know whether they're still aligned with us because, of course, the 2 Russian probes to Phobos were shot down by the indigenous Martians, presumably on Phobos. So there may have already been hostilities in which the Martians that we were aligned with in 1970 said, no, we don't like what your goals are here. You Americans and you Russians, don't even come here anymore. Okay, so we have the additional element of Phobos 1 and 2 being shot down, presumably by the indigenous human civilization on Mars. And that would be, it's another major topic in exopolitics.
Is there any evidence to presume that the Martians did that, or that could the Americans have done that?
We could have done it. An extraterrestrial civilization then on the surface could have done it. But again, applying Occam's razor, since there was no evidence of other forces being near the 2 Russian probes, presumably, and because they were photographed, I believe that the missiles were photographed before the Phobos television feed stopped. The likeliest explanation is that Phobos 1 and 2 were shot down by the Martians because the Martians were hostile to the notion of those 2 probes landing on Phobos. Now, Hoagland and others are claiming that Phobos 1, or is it, well, Phobos is Phobos. I was confusing with the probes. That Phobos is an artificial satellite, and I just have no opinion on that because I haven't taken any interest on that. But we do have the notion of incipient conflict between 2 Russian Mars probes and apparently the indigenous Martian space program. And again, that's another reason why we want to normalize relations with the Martians, inform the human population on Earth that we have a presence there, and allow them to migrate here, because they're really our long-lost cousins, and there's really no reason for our 2 populations to be in conflict, and every reason for them to be in productive dealings, or harmonious relations. Yes, sir?
With them not paying you back in your youth because they said you would be a whistleblower, did they bother paying you this when you serviced Mars?
No.
So it's all, they made it clear to be volunteer service, or they promised you money and they didn't?
They kind of, they use brainwashing, but they also select individuals who, they're not really super patriots, they pick the super responsible. As Courtney Hunt once described it, we pick people who, if they're expected to do a job, and let's say they may think they're on camera doing it, or anything, they not only do what's right, but they try to maintain the appearance of propriety. They're the kind of people who go back and change the evidence of something to show that they didn't do something wrong, even when they didn't. So they tend to select super responsible personalities. I bet if you did a personality profile of Barack Obama, Regina Dugan, myself, and Brett Stillings, you would find that we were the kid who walked 2 miles to deliver the overdue library book. Right here.
Did you see water and how water was or wasn't integrated in the environment?
I saw minimal vegetation, so presumably there was water in those locations. I didn't see any standing bodies of water on the surface, but we did find the lake beneath Husband Hill in PIA 10214.
Underground then?
Yeah, and in fact, in PIA 11049, we have that viaduct with apparently water falling into kind of a catch basin, which means that some intelligent humanoids, whether it's us or the indigenous Martians, are actually using that as a viaduct from an aquifer and depositing in something like a public bath. Laura?
What was the, you said blue sky. What about clouds? What about weather, temperature?
I saw no clouds, presumably because of the relative lack of moisture on the surface. But Mars has a beautiful baby blue sky, like you find.
Wind and temperature?
The temperature I encountered most of the time was very much like this temperature right now, basically like you're 70, 75, much drier than this, but more like Arizona at 75 degrees, kind of weather where you only begin perspiring if you exert yourself, not just put your clothes on in the morning. And in terms of the blue sky, I stated it from the very beginning of my interviews, and I'd like to actually dedicate this talk to Paul Goodwin at Mars Uncensored, who's a researcher in Britain, because Paul really stood by, he basically followed my claims, and then he's begun the process of validating them with the data, and he and I have now both published images of the blue sky on Mars. It's a very beautiful blue, kind of like when you're in Arizona, and there's extremely diffuse cloud cover, so you get that kind of pale, baby blue blanket kind of blue. That's the color of the sky there, against a very rusty red terrain. Right here?
Were you ever told to bring something back and didn't, or had you ever desired?
No, both in Pegasus and the Mars project, we were practicing basically the prime directive. In fact, the phrase the prime directive from Star Trek was even used in the lectures. And relative to life forms there, not just artifacts, we were instructed never to return with anything. Although one time I came back with the red dust of Mars on my hiking boots, and my mother asked, well, what's that red stuff on your boots? And I said, well, I was down behind the gas station, I was just talking to somebody, I was kicking at this dirt pile where there was rusting spark plugs. And again, I was trained to lie to my mom. I don't feel good about that, but so no, artifacts were not supposed to come back, because this was a deep black project where a Martian artifact we would have been responsible for ending project, for ending operational security. So we were under orders not to return with any animal life form or artifact, or even basic natural evidence like a rock or intentional soil in our pocket or anything like that. And no life form, certainly. But also, I just want to emphasize the point again that, the post-Vietnam take on my information, if my information was presumed to be valid, which it is, would be, look at how bellicose the United States was being in establishing its hegemony on planet Mars. But in fact, we were under express instructions that it was our option to sacrifice ourselves and not fire our weapon if we were going to be eaten. So in other words, the onus was on us to begin hostile dealings, and we were instructed not to if we could tolerate it. So we were given weaponry, but we were basically instructed to try not to use it. And Ed even said, I've often imagined what I would do if I was in front of one of those things, and I guess I would say something like, oh, it's been a good life, bite my head off. He said something like that. So bite my head off first. So really, the point I'm making there is, while we were a hegemonistic presence, we were not a militaristic presence. We were applying the prime directive and literally instructed to try to be willing to sacrifice ourselves rather than use the weapon to kill a predator that was going to eat us. Michael?
There's a long-standing debate about where everything evolves. So I was just wondering if you had an overview. And it triggered your thing about the microbial life being the same on Earth and Mars triggers that. I mean, do we have coevolution? Does the life come from one place to the other?
I'm not an adherent to this view, but I suspect that the notion of panspermia, that there's been intentional seeding of life on inhabitable planets, explains the commonality of life forms that we find on Earth and Mars. And, we see these common substrates, present Earth species on Mars, extinct Earth species, hybrids, and life forms that have never appeared on Earth, but that still follow the patterns of form and structure that we associate with biological life forms.
Do you think the indigenous ones evolved on Mars?
Yes, I think that there's a strata of indigenous life forms on Mars, and that the human presence that's like us is the result of a Mars colony established by the High Egyptian civilization. I think it makes much more sense that this beautiful, sustainable, abundant biosphere that we live in built that first civilization on Earth, to include the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, the great platform of Baalbek in Lebanon and so forth, and other phenomenal artifacts. And that it then went to Mars and created a colony that then introduced those humans into Mars, who then got separated from us and have been breeding in isolation from us since then. And in support of that, I would marshal the fact that the Great Pyramid, the same day every year, the passageway of the King's Chamber focuses a red orb on the wall above the head of the sarcophagus of the pharaoh, to mark as a kind of a marking stone to the linkage between Egypt and Mars. So I think we got there with human life, and then those humans got cut off from us by the catastrophe and have been breeding in isolation ever since. But if you think about the relative genetic isolation, let's say between Europeans and, I don't know, let's say indigenous people in Central America, that isolation may have been as much as 11,500 years, and reproduction can occur between individual human beings of such diverse backgrounds. So I think we may even be able to intermarry and breed with the surviving human remnant on Mars if they were to come here. Yes, ma'am?
Could you say a bit more about the connection between Akhenaten and Obama?
Well, it's been noted that he and Michelle Obama and their two daughters, Sasha and Malia, closely resemble basically several figures from the highest Egyptian civilization. The point I was making is that when you examine the Secret Service names that Barack, Michelle, Malia, and Sasha Obama were given, they seem to refer to Pharaoh Akhenaten. Barack Obama's Secret Service handle was renegade, and Akhenaten was a renegade in Egyptian history because he broke away from pantheism and was the first pharaoh to embrace monotheism. Michelle Obama apparently was assigned the name Renaissance, and the reign of Akhenaten and Nefertiti worked a renaissance of the high Egyptian civilization. We know probably that Akhenaten was sort of the John F. Kennedy of the Egyptian space era and got the high Egyptian civilization out into the solar system. In the famous I forget what they're called. They're not amulets, but what are they called? The Egyptian identity symbols? Cartouches, thank you. I always forget that word. Such a strange word. In the cartouche for Akhenaten, there's two symbols that are prominent. The radiance of the sun and the rosebud. And that's what Malia and Sasha's Secret Service names are radiance and rosebud. But of course, Malia's radiantly pretty and Sasha's a little rosebud, so that may have just been accidental, but it seems quite coincidental to me. I don't know.
Because that connection came to me in meditation during the Obama election. It's the first time I hear that actually might be a connection.
Well, we'd like to credit our friend Freeman Fly, who has identified some of these connections and introduced them to us to them in April in Philadelphia. So, but it's certainly coincidental that 4 Secret Service names of the president, his wife, and their 2 daughters would seem to resonate with the history and significance of Pharaoh Akhenaten. That seems very strange, especially since Barack Obama so closely resembles one of the pharaohs as seen in statuary.
Yeah, I was going to say they showed all the whole family resembles the whole pharaoh's family. Why?
Well, Freeman is speculating as to whether or not they're clones that were taken from mummies and created. Certainly the Barry Soetoro that I interacted with in 1980 and the Barack Obama, as he was calling himself by 1982, was quite a normal chap. I mean, he was a very likable and admirable guy. I didn't find anything strange about him at all. And of course, we know that he was born of a mother that descends from the British oligarchy. That is his mother, Stanley Ann Dunham. The Dunham family is part of the British landed gentry, and that is the pharaohic bloodline. So he may have just possessed a similar phenotype or appearance to one of the pharaohs because he was born of a British, or ultimately, originally British bloodline on his matrilineal DNA side with an admixture of African blood in the nature of the black pharaohs. It just could be just an outcome from the genetic lottery that we all play at birth. But also, there's only something like 10,000 phenotypes, so he just may have the black pharaoh one. And if that's the case, I think that speaks well of the American people in electing him. But I don't want to sound too elitist there, but I mean, he doesn't have to be cloned from a mummy to look like one of the black pharaohs because he's a biracial ancestry, and it's British and African ancestry, which is right there, with the pharaohic bloodlines on 2 sides. potentially.
I had part two of the question. When you proposed that we might invite the indigenous Martian race here, would that include all the rays and the hybrid rays?
Well, those are questions we'd have to ask in terms of the suitability of all the humanoid life forms. What I mean is apparently our relatives there who are clamoring to be reunited with Earth, they're basically the vestigial civilization, or the vestigial population of a group of us who were trapped up there 11,500 years ago. They're the descendants of those colonists. And so I think they would have actually a right under abiding nostrums of public international law, a right of return to their home planet. I think that would be an emanation from existing immigration law and policy, in the way that Israel upholds the right of return for Jews and that type of thing. They are us, and so I don't know of any law of exclusion except maybe public safety in terms of a viral contamination type scenario a la the moon that would allow us not to let them return just because they've been part of the human population that's been evolving and breeding within isolation up there for 11,500 years. And they weren't that different than from modern humans. They just looked a little bit more rugged, a little bit more genetically isolated from the perspective of a 8-year-old. I was at that time. But I would certainly support them being integrated back in our society, and it appears that they may already have been.
But we don't know if they all live together underground, how integrated this society is with all the different species or the different cultures.
We don't.
And if they're very integrated and possibly intermarried and hybridized together, then how would you separate?
I would, if they're nonviolent and humanoid and sentient, I think that we should try to integrate it. I think I was mentioning how the evolution of the Nuremberg principles and the whole emergence of human rights under, for example, Eleanor Roosevelt, the international, the Universal Convention on Human Rights, the Nuremberg principles, and sort of the evolution of public international law after World War II, and then environmental law can now be applied to the Martian context. And then the third area would be the evolution of civil rights laws in the 1960s and just the evolution of the public understanding that people, let's say with different skin tones, are human beings just like each other, is also something that comes right at the time in Earth history where we would have to exercise not just toleration or tolerance, but respect and say, well, these people, the men of their culture may look a little bit more rugged than our men, because they've been breeding in isolation for almost 12,000 years. I guess what I'm saying is we've laid the foundation also in civil rights law and the new understanding that people have that all of us human beings share 87% of the same genes, that we can recognize that other people aren't another species just because they possess different indelible characteristics. We now have the opportunity to apply that to our genetic relatives on another planet. So I would think that it might be complicated if they're in fact intermeshed with other life forms from the cosmos, but then again, if they're nonviolent, sentient neighbors of ours, why wouldn't we integrate them into our civilization if they asked? I would think we should explore that. I think it would be good, especially for us. Star?
How readily do you think they could adapt to Earth life on the surface? And currently with things like radiation all over the place and economic situation going crazy, maybe they, have trouble coming here and living like an Earth human.
Right.
With everything in the social structures and the economic structures and the way things have been controlled for so long. I mean, they might be better off where they are in a way, except
or
for
if
the beauty of
well,
Earth. And
yeah, because they've evolved underground and hence may have less melanin to produce pigment to block solar radiation even on a planet like ours with an adequate ionosphere, they might have to choose between living underground on Mars and, as Courtney Brown found, living under a mountain in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I think if I had that choice, I would pick the underground location in New Mexico. In other words, there's not a need to integrate them into every aspect of civilization and the environment as we live it. But the fundamental question of whether we should permit them to come here and settle here, if they ask, I think we're under not just a moral duty, but an ongoing legal and political duty to say yes, because they are the remnant of stranded humans.